Hello, it's Beth from Ruth Stitchery and ruthstitchery.com, and we're doing another video to hopefully make you as successful as you can be when you are piecing your quilt blocks together. So we've done a couple videos already. We've talked about that perfect quarter inch seam allowance and some tips on how to get that consistent. We did a video on pressing and different tips to get the seams pressed as flat as you can get them in your block. And what we have not talked about yet, which I want to talk about today, is cutting your fabric and making sure that you are cutting it straight, the right size, and not on the bias so that it's stretchy in any way. So I wanted to start out asking if you have ever cut strips off of your fabric and they end up looking a little bit something like this. I call it the boomerang. And you lay this out and you start cutting off of your strip, but you realize as you get to the middle and you're in your fold, you've got this little curve. If you've ever had that, you're not alone. I remember getting started quilting and I had no idea, and this is what would happen. And so I would cut my pieces up to a certain point and I'd just chop that middle part off, and then I would keep going. What I didn't realize then that I realize now is that a strip that ends up looking like this is not being cut on the straight of grain or even the cross grain. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by that and how you can always make sure that your strips are completely straight and you don't get this boomerang in the middle. So as you know, the fabric that's on these bolts, they are printed and then they get folded in half and rolled by these giant machines onto the bolt of fabric. And those machines are going really fast, and so a lot of times we start cutting off of a bolt and they're not straight. And so if you buy fabric and you take it home and you just start cutting your strips off it without straightening it, that's how you end up with this boomerang. So some are better than others, and I would say that most likely the time that it's going to be a piece of fabric that you've gotten cut is the least straight, is going to be kind of toward the beginning of that bolt or the very end of that bolt. So if you've ever bought fabric right at the end of the bolt, you know it's all folded up in there, and I usually tell people, like, I think it's this much left on the bolt, but you never know how much is folded up inside there. And so kind of the beginning of the bolt and the end of the bolt tend to be where I find that they are most off, I should say. And so I wanted to show you what one of the first things that you need to do. Certainly if you wash your fabric, you're going to have to do this anyway, but if you are not washing and you've just got a piece, so I have just cut this 1 yard piece off of our bolt, and if you, I don't know how easy it is to see, where it's going selvage to selvage there, it's not completely lined up right here, and it's a little bit farther away here than it is over here. So that right away tells me that if I were to just start cutting on this, if I started cutting several strips, I'm going to have a little bit of that boomerang, but more so I'm going to have a little stretch. So I wanted to really quickly just tell you what I'm talking about when I say you want to make sure that you are cutting on the straight of grain or on the cross grain. So fabric is a woven material. So all these little threads are interweaving together. You want to cut your strips on the straight of grain, which would be selvage to selvage. So every bolt has a selvage on each end. So that is the straight of grain. You're not going to have a lot of stretch in there if you are cutting it right on the straight of grain. The cross grain goes basically parallel to the selvage. And so the way that the fabric is woven, if you are cutting parallel to that selvage, you also will not have that stretch. So true bias on a piece of fabric is 45 degrees. So if I were to cut this fabric at a 45-degree angle, that's kind of true bias. And if I were to take that piece of fabric, it would be super stretchy. So basically, it's just I've compromised the strength of the weave by cutting it on the bias and cutting on the diagonal. So even if I'm not on that true bias, but I'm not cutting directly straight on the grain, I'm going to have a little bit of that stretch. And so if you've ever wondered, you know you cut the pieces the right size, you put your block together, but for some reason it's kind of wavy, it's not quite fitting quite right, it's not the exact right size. It is probably because even though they're cut the right size, if any of those sides are stretchy at all because they are not straight, your pieces can get a little bit warped just from just a teeny tiny bit of pull. So I want to tell you how to get rid of that. So this one isn't too bad, but this is right off the bolt, and right away I see that my selvages aren't matching up. So I first want to make sure that I sort of refold this and line up those selvages together. So I'm going to fold this again in half. This time I'm going to make sure that my selvage is right up against each other. So it's right up against each other. Then I'm going to have to sort of pick it up and make sure that it is straight. So now that I have done that, and I'm straight, if you look now what has happened over here, I can see that I'm about a 1/4 inch off there, but I know that I am now, my selvage is straight across here, and I am now folded right on the straight of grain. And so I need to trim that off before I start cutting. So as soon as I get that evened off, I know that I'm able to start cutting on this piece of fabric. I'm right on the straight of grain. I'm not going to have any pull. I do the same thing if I am cutting off of a fat quarter. So a fat quarter, as you know, is a 1/2 yard cut, and then it's cut in half. So every fat quarter has a selvage side on it. Okay, so I know where that selvage is straight. So I will open up my fat quarter, I'm going to press it really well, and then I'm going to refold this, and I'm going to make sure that that selvage is straight across. This one isn't too bad, but I can see that I have a little bit on this side, about 1/8 of an inch that I need to trim off. If I were working on the other side, it's actually a little bit more. So this is kind of one of the reasons that in the store, when we're cutting fat quarters, we kind of go a little bit over that 1/2 yard mark before we cut that piece, and then we cut it in half, because we know you're probably going to be doing a little bit of trimming on each side. So that is the first thing. You've got to make sure that you set yourself up for success and get your fabric completely straight so that you're on the straight of grain before you start cutting. Okay, so I had about a 1/4 inch there that I had to trim off, so I have trimmed that off now. And if you are, a couple things, if you are a beginner and you don't have all of these quilting tools, I would tell you that if you're going to buy one ruler, I usually suggest to a beginner to get a 6.5 by 12.5 inch ruler. My other thing for that is not everybody has a designated quilting space, a room, a sewing studio, or a craft room. And so a lot of times you're just on the kitchen table, or you're on the kitchen counter, or you just have a small space. And so you don't always have a large cutting table like this. So a lot of times you need a smaller mat and the 6.5 by 12.5. And in order to start cutting on this piece, I'm trimmed off, but I know this ruler isn't going to fit all the way across. So what I want to do is give this fabric another fold. I'm going to make sure that that fold again is straight with that selvage. So I want to make sure that my fabric stays completely straight. It looks pretty good. I'm straight right here on the edge. And now that I have folded it again, my ruler is going to cover so that I can start cutting strips. So that boomerang also that I showed you comes from you just taking my ruler, and I'm going to line it up with this edge, and I'm going to start cutting. If you're not paying any attention to the other lines on your ruler, after you cut a few strips, you might get a little bit off. And so I always tell people that the first thing I want you to do is line up one of your horizontal lines on your ruler with that fold. So I'm taking this 1-inch line that's going across here, and I'm making sure that it is right across the fold, and that way I know this strip that I cut is going to be straight. And then it just depends on what size width strip I'm going to do. So say I'm going to cut a 2.5-inch strip. I'm going to keep this horizontal line here, and then I am going to line up the edge, and then I am ready to cut. And so the next thing I'm going to show you is how you want to cut your fabric. Okay, so we're ready to cut that strip. Our ruler is lined up. I'm at 2.5. I'm even across the fold on one of my horizontal lines. And this is another thing that a lot of times in my beginner class, I have people practice in class cutting the fabric because you would think it's a very simple thing. We're using a rotary cutter. There are lots of different rotary cutters out there. I don't know that I have a particular favorite, but of course the 45 millimeter one is the size I would tell you to get. But there's lots of them out here. This is one of Olfa's newest one. It's so pretty. And you just pull this down and the blade is there, and then you push it up to lock it. We also have the ones that they consider like an ergonomic. I have a couple of those. The ergonomic ruler, this is also by Olfa, still 45 millimeter, but you can tell it looks a lot different than the others. These have this little red button that I'm going to unlock them, and then you just squeeze. So as you squeeze this handle, the blade comes out. When you let go, the blade goes in. So I do love these because of the safety feature there. As soon as you let go, that blade is no longer out there and someone could cut themselves. It also feels really nice to just be able to squeeze that. So of course there's lots of others. This one's very similar to the one that I'm using. This is Tula Pinks, which, I mean, how pretty is that? It feels really nice in the hand, and then to get the blade out, it just has this little knob here. So it's really, really easily accessible to your thumb here to pull it back, blade is out, push it forward, and now the blade is covered. So really it all comes down to personal choice, what feels good in your hand when you're cutting. So there's lots of options out there. So for today I'm using one of these, but a lot of times people think that they're going to stand here at their ruler and they should be going straight out. If you're doing this, you don't have very much control over your arm. And so it takes more effort and more strength in your arm to try to stay straight when you're like this. And because you're using more strength, most likely that ruler is going to shift on you. And so I always tell people, take a step to the left. If you're right-handed, take a step to your left. If you are left-handed, you will take a step to your right. And I tell people to remember to shoot from the hip. So just remember that I have a lot more control of my arm. Just think about going to the bowling alley. If you're bowling, you don't bowl like this because you can't really control where the ball's going. You bowl like this because you can pull your arm back and forward. I sound like I'm a bowler. I'm not, but That's all I can think about, is if I can control something going straight because my arm is moving this way. It's the same when you're cutting your fabric. You want to have the most control so that you don't move your ruler and you don't have to use a ton of strength to cut. So I'm shooting right from my hip. So I'm going to start on the mat, not on the fabric. I'm on the mat right up against my ruler, and then I'm going to cut this strip. After you've cut for a while, you will know just by hearing it if you've actually cut all the way through. Something else I tell my beginners, it's kind of hard to get lined back up if you haven't cut all the way through. So I always say, leave your ruler where it is, pull your fabric away to see. If your fabric doesn't pull all the way away, you didn't get all the way through the 4 layers, and you don't have to reposition your ruler. All you have to do is take another swipe with your rotary cutter without having to readjust your ruler. So shoot from the hip, and you will come up with a perfectly straight strip every time. No boomerang in there. And then the whole strip is usable to start to cut it into the segments that your pattern tells you to. And so if I'm cutting a lot of strips, then I will of course continue down, and every now and then, it's just the nature of cutting fabric. Once you cut about maybe 3 or 4 strips, you may have to adjust again and sort of trim off that edge so that you can stay straight. But the biggest thing I want you to take away is when you go to cut a strip, you want to make sure that you line that horizontal line up onto the fold, get it lined up to the width that you want, and then shoot from the hip. Okay, so I have told you that this is typically the ruler that I recommend if you're just going to buy one ruler. This will do everything for you. 6.5 by 12.5. This one's the Creative Grids. It has the built-in grippy on the back. They have the little circles, and then the edges have a material to help your ruler not slip. There are some rulers out there, though, that don't have this on there, and I'm going to talk in just a minute about what you can do to make sure that your ruler doesn't slip on you. So if you do have a larger cut station, you have a cutting table, maybe you have a space that your cut table stays up all the time, you're able to have a larger mat, that is when I would maybe suggest going to the longer ruler. This is a 6.5 by 24.5, and when you use a ruler this size, you don't have to fold your fabric up that second time. You can leave it right off the bolts with the one fold. Of course, you want to straighten it up as best you can before you start cutting, but you don't have to fold it and cut through 4 layers. You can just cut through the 2 with the longer ruler. So that's the 6.5 by 24.5. In the beginner class, I also do suggest that eventually, if you realize like quilting is something I'm going to do a lot of patterns out there have 6.5-inch blocks and 12.5-inch blocks. Those are kind of your more standard block sizes for a lot of patterns. And so they do make 6.5-inch square rulers and 12.5-inch square rulers. So as time goes by, these are 2 that you may want to invest in because you can easily square up your blocks, make sure your blocks are the right size with both of these rulers. So these are 2 that I would suggest that maybe you would want to kind of add to your toolbox at some point. A couple of other rulers, I mean, they have all different size rulers out there, but I wanted to show again, we've shown this a couple of times. I love this little ruler, not only because it says Ruth Stitchery on it, but 2.5 by 6.5. It's just such a great size ruler to throw into your bag when you're going somewhere to maybe quilt with friends. It's a great little measurement that you can just grab and measure something right off the bat. If you're cutting 2.5-inch squares off of a strip, so I might cut my fabric off of the bolts and off of my big piece, and then I'm cutting maybe 2.5-inch squares out of it, I'll grab a ruler like this that's smaller to do the sub-cutting off of that strip. So love this ruler. And this is a 4.5 by 12.5. So again, if maybe I'm cutting a lot of 2.5-inch strips, maybe having a ruler that's not quite as wide as the 6.5 would work. I'll have to tell you, I'm obsessed with a lot of quilting stuff, and rulers is one of them. So I think I might have almost every size of square ruler out there, because you never know what size block you're going to have, and you want to see if you're right on. But so there's a lot of them. So here's a 4.5 by 12.5. You have lots of options out there. And so depending on the brand of ruler you have, some are have that grip built in and some don't. And so I'm looking at the OmniGrid ruler. This is that 12.5-inch. This one doesn't have any grip built in. So there are some tools out there that you can purchase to help you with making this no-slip ruler. So there is a spray that's called Grippy that you can reapply as often as you need to the back of your ruler, and it puts a film on the back of your ruler so that it doesn't slip. It will eventually start to wear off, so you can just reapply it. It does not damage your ruler to keep doing that. They also, there's a couple companies out there that make these little adhesive rings that you can peel and strategically place them on your ruler, and they're kind of like a rubber, and so when you place them down on your fabric, it makes it so that they don't slip. There's also things like little sandpaper circles, and so there's lots of tools out there for you to help you make a ruler into a non-slip ruler. Or if this starts to wear off a little bit, you may want to put something like these little rings or spray the Grippy on it. And finally, if I'm going to do a pattern and it might tell me to cut 22.5-inch strips off my fabric. So it's repetitive, I'm cutting the same size over and over and over again. Well, to make it a little bit easier on myself so that every time I lay my ruler down, I'm not having to find that 2.5 on my ruler, they make some tools that don't hurt your ruler, that you can easily put on your ruler and then take off, doesn't leave any residue behind, and you can kind of mark that size. So there is some glow line tape in these really bright colors, you can't miss them, that I can put on my ruler, and that way I can line it right up there, say on that 2.5-inch line, and then it's really easy for me to just keep placing my ruler down exactly where it needs to go. GE Designs, she has, I know this is hard to see, but she's got little stickers. These have little arrows on them, and she's got them in different colors. And so I may take a ruler, and maybe this pattern tells me I'm going to cut some 2.5-inch strips, and I'm going to cut some 5-inch squares. And so I can take these little arrows, and maybe the blue one is at the 2.5, the pink one is at the 5, and then again that way it's already marked for me. It's easily placing my ruler down there. So lots of tools out there that you can use to help you become as successful as you can in your cutting, which is one of those steps that I believe can make you the most successful when you are piecing your blocks together. Thanks so much for watching. We're getting more and more people watching our videos, which is so exciting for us. So please don't forget to share our videos, follow us on Facebook, and we really appreciate you supporting us.